It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another SDG Podcast. Joining me today, I've got Chad Juttner, Sarah Rochford, and Jen Eman. We'll get it right eventually.
I'm not doing that again, Peter.
That's fair. And today we're going to be talking about technical interviewing. Kind of both sides of the table, I think. Chad, you sort of started this ball rolling. Where were you thinking we're going to roll first?
So I was going to take from the standpoint of as folks that interview people, what's your approach to it? What are you looking for? What are some red flags? And maybe a horror story or two would be fun at the end. That's the approach, Peter.
I'm sure there's no horror stories because we've all had wonderful times and everybody's always showed up on time and the right day and everything to all the technical interviews. And
never had somebody show up to a technical interview with a Big Johnson shirt on.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Yes, I have.
Oh my gosh. We're already ready to dive into those horror stories.
Yeah.
It sounds like.
The horror stories are easy. Well, let's start simple. What are you looking for? Sarah, what do you look for when you start off a technical interview? Do you just go right, tell me about all that you know about C# and internet and everything, or?
Tell me about the internet. No.
Tell me about the
internet. Mine's evolved over the years, right? For a decade before I was with SDG, I did interviews for positions where I wasn't a consultant, right? It was we're at a employer, we have a known tech stack, it's going to be these things, we have a project we know you're going to be on. And so for me, those interviews were very focused on are you going to know this specific tech stack and where are the gaps? And yeah, we jump right into since there'd be several interviews, right? This would be part of a technical, let's just see if they know where they're at for the stack that we're going to be developing in, the problem space we're going to be solving, right? And but that's kind of shifted for me, going from that environment to being a consultant. It's not like I can say for sure what tools and technologies they're going to be coding in or working in. Might be C#.
Right.
Last night I was chatting with some of the Microsoft group, folks are doing React and doing Python and doing, right? So you kind of have to shift a little bit.
Yeah, I've noticed there's been more of a push to try and find people who know a lot more. If we're interviewing for back end, they want them to at least know how to function and do stuff in the front end. You don't have to be a front end developer, but
right.
You at least got to understand the tech and at least be able to do some things in order a lot more and more what people are looking for, the full stack. I say full stack because really I feel like a true full stack would do DevOps and that's true full stack.
Oh, that is full stack. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I don't know. I even with just front end versus back end development, I feel like you're either really good in one and can hold your own a little bit in the other. There's not a lot of people that are really, really good in both.
Yeah, and since you kind of have to gauge, you don't know exactly what the tech stack is, I don't start there. I like to start with, tell me about what you're working on today. What's your most recent project? Tell me about what you're doing. So it just can start very conversationally and can hear about, a lot of times people get a chance then to share the things that they're excited about it, right? This is the cool thing that I just did. And then through that story, I can ask some deeper dive questions, tell me about, you said you were using, .NET Core APIs. Now I can sprinkle in some questions and get some deeper dive into the tech stack there. Oh, where do you like to have the logic for that? You put everything in the controller, right?
Yeah.
Always in everything.
What do you even need a service layer for? Just everything goes in the controller, right?
I mean,
that's right.
Why wouldn't you? 10,000 lines is not too big a controller.
Yep.
Chad, how about you? How do you start off a tech interview?
Usually with drinks.
Okay.
And this was a thing. So
you just drink quietly for a minute or two and just not say a word, or?
Well, so this isn't. I wouldn't do this at SDG, but when I previously I would interview and it was part of a small startups, right? So the first interview was always with me, and I used to do that. Like if we would intentionally schedule them for like 2-3 o'clock, right?
Right.
Or noon or 11 a.m. And I would come in with, a 6-pack of grain belt and put it on the table. I would open one. And I'm like, hey, if you want, go ahead, get comfortable. We're going to be here for a while.
And they're like, oh my goodness, what did I just get myself into?
It is and so as an icebreaker, like that is a nice, I mean, what did I do there, right? Like all of a sudden, okay, here's the company culture. This is the guy I'm going to work with. Like, if you're in, you're in. If you're uncomfortable right now, then this probably might, without even saying anything, like, and them taking or not taking a beer does not have any influence on the interview. It's really just, or on, whether I'm going to bring them on. It was really just a kind of an icebreaker and kind of one of those things you can do at a tiny little company.
So is that sort of getting at sort of the unanswerable questions? You can kind of like, you can ask questions without asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Harder to do when you're virtual, though. I mean, you could still have a beer, but
yeah,
he just holds up a picture.
And it's another part. Like I've interviewed people for my project, prior to them joining a project, and that's all been virtual. And you're right, that's its own little special set of challenges. But by and large, like, every time I've done it, and I haven't done it for SDG yet, but every single person that I've brought on previously, when I've done interviews, it's been in person. I've been able to pick up on a ton of nonverbal cues, right?
Sure.
And there's just so much more information to be gleaned by being like right across from a person.
you bring up a really good point about that. Like I've done a lot of interviewing before coming to SDG, and since coming to SDG, I've even done interviews for a client because they didn't have, staff to be able to interview for the project, so didn't know how to. So I've actually done the interviews for clients to hire FTEs, and then I've done interviews for SDG, and it really has shifted away from in person and to being virtual, and you really do lose a lot of that. I mean, you can pick up on it if you're paying close attention, but I think seeing somebody uncomfortable tells you a lot about how they handle stress.
Yeah,
Very
and
true.
also, just for the record, this is the first time ever since I've known her that Jen has said, "You've got a good point, Chad," and I don't think I'm ever going to hear that again.
You better mark it on the calendar. It might not happen again.
Oh, trust me, Friday the 13th, Freaky Friday.
See, that's why.
Yeah,
everything's going sideways because it's Friday the 13th.
We are recording this, so we do have a record.
Yeah,
you have proof. Watch that. They'll go back and look at it, and that whole part of it will just be a glitch. Like it just, I don't know why that just cut out.
So,
what about
Chad, do you think it would be different if you brought in a 12-pack or a case of grain belt and said this is going to take a while?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm trying to think of how I would react if I were the person being interviewed and there was a 24-pack there, right? Like that's
you'd be like, what are you gonna drink?
Yeah, I honestly, it might be a little bit, but I don't know. I just over the course of time, right? And again, like I'm not going to do this at SDG. We that was a different little culture, completely different set of circumstances, but. I did it often and frequently, and there was a lot of little tricks that just really helped me. Like one of the things I don't really ask questions about the tech stack, not because I'm interviewing consultants, right? It's because they don't get an option. They don't get an opinion on the tech stack, right? Like they don't. So I don't ask specific deep questions about Spring Boot or blah, 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 right? Like I always keep them more freeform, right? And I just have like a handful of things, depending on what level I'm interviewing for. Like I will literally just give them a whiteboard and a marker and say, hey, like let's draw out how you would build a greenfield blog application, right? Like you're going to build WordPress from scratch, right? Like let's draw out what that is and make your technology decisions. And we'll just talk about why that over, different things. And that's a lot more fun because then you don't get a guy just stressing over like, oh, did I get this? Or I'm sorry, I've been trying to say person this entire time. Thanks, Jen.
But point it out.
Yeah, nope, I knew you would catch me at least once. But then you would get a person that doesn't care less if they've memorized all of the annotations for a service or for a repository for anything else, right? Like you can Google all of that stuff and it's pretty, straightforward.
Totally.
But if you can describe like architectural patterns and like you guys were saying, right? Like, yeah, don't throw everything in the controller, use a service and what goes on the front end and what stays on the back end. And that separation of concerns is way more interesting to talk about than walk me through Spring Boot from Hello World to, full stack enterprise app.
Oh, I completely agree. It was also one of those things that I had to get used to doing interviews for SDG because I wasn't sitting in a conference room with a whiteboard behind me. Right? Because I've had those times too where I'm like, oh, I'd like you to draw up for me, a database. You're going to have to do something all the way from here to there, right? But you can't have that whiteboard. Apparently, they won't let you wheel it in to like the restaurant. When you're conducting an interview over lunch, right? Now that a lot of them are virtual, you've got some options for drawing on a canvas or something, doing something like that. But it has kind of shifted. Like, tell me, it became tell me, what would that look like, right? Describe it. Which I've almost found is even more fun because the ability to communicate those concepts rather than just visually in ways other than visual representations has told me a lot too, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
I like that whole idea too of like talk to me about architecture because like you said, tech stack, you can solve the same problem with lots of different things. You can use Java or .NET or, it really can vary depending on the circumstances and what the client's already using or if you're going for an FTE at a place, what they're using, you're probably going to be pigeonholed into whatever it is they're using. So I like, tell me about the architecture part because you really need to understand how to do that part and you can figure out the syntax for the rest of it.
And then it also like once they're at a whiteboard and they have like, yeah, I'm going to do, this React thing over here and this .NET layer here and my database is going to be whatever, Oracle or whatever. Then I can actually like dig in and say, hey, what happens over here on the database? Like how do you solve database performance issues, right? In your database of source. Like, do you know what an explain plan is? Like that's where all of the actual technical questions become, you can ask those there. And if they don't know, like I start to lead them on a little bit. But if I really want to hear explain plan from a guy, like I try to get to that question every single interview. And then I also try to get to like, depending on what level they're coming in at, like, what do you know about thread pools and database connectivity, like JDBC pools on the Java side, right? Like, how would you tune that stuff? Like, we get into that, but you start like way, way up here with something that's easily recognized.
I love the performance question. So the way that I like to ask that one, I've learned to ask it, is the way that I almost always get it at work, which is the app is slow. So someone comes to you and says, this app's slow. What do you do first? And then as they start going through it, I'll be like, nope, you found out that that's working great, right? And so we go through. And I love my favorite things to hear from candidates are asking me questions back in those situations, right?
Absolutely.
If they're like, well, it's probably going to be in the database. So then this, right? It's like, well, I also like hearing a question or two, right? Before you start saying it's probably this. This is a whole huge hypothetical situation. It's probably nothing.
Right.
Right.
It's
probably
just
user error.
perception and their home internet is slow today.
Right. But yeah, I also like asking questions around when things didn't go right. Like you were trying to troubleshoot performance and, tell me, well, that one's a bad example, but like I always ask the question like, okay, you're in the code and you're troubleshooting something and you come across some code that the person that sits right next to you or that you talk to every day wrote and it's like bad. You look at it and you're like, oh, this is the worst code I have seen. Like, did a third grader write this? Like, and then like, what do you do? Do you leave the code? Like, I try not to lead them. I just try to say, what do you do? And see, I really like to see how people handle that interpersonal relationships, right? Because you have to work with these people all the time. So like I actually had somebody once tell me, well, I would take them out back and give them a what for. Like you don't write
what
bad
for?
code.
Wow.
I know how I've handled that in the past. Like if I see that exact situation, some dude sitting next to me wrote the most repugnant, I was going to start quoting Pulp Fiction, and I realized I can get one word out and before I have to stop. But like truly horrible stuff. And I just said to the guy, I'm like, hey, are you going to be here in 2 hours? And he's like, yeah, why? I'm like, I'm going to head down to the bar. I'm going to have some Jägermeister in order to see things from your perspective when you wrote this, right? And I'll be back. And obviously a total joke, but it like totally diffused it. And he's like, he looked at it and he's like, I mean, yeah, solid, right?
Right.
And
what do you do if you look at that code and it's yours? That's a bigger question still, right?
I always tell people that if you look at your code that you wrote a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and you don't go, oh, I totally could have done it this way, you're not growing as a developer.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah, you should be able to look at your old code and think there are better ways to do that because they're constantly coming out with better ways to do things. And if you can't look at some code and say, I mean, of course, you're going to find stuff where you're like, yeah, I mean, I was on point when I wrote that. This is going to be in use for the next 10 years and be solid and perfect, which chances are stuff you wrote is going to be in use for the next 10 years. You know, that PLC.
Regardless, right? Yeah.
No, I like your code review example too, because I don't know too many developers that pick up someone else's code and think, I would do this differently. Right? Like that's what a lot of us will go through and think that, right? And that question about how do you handle a code review and what's your approach to it? I think the point about interpersonal skills, because that's something you're going to do all the time, right? All the time you're going to have these opportunities to mentor junior developers, have opportunities to grow your own skill set. And so being able to, give and receive that feedback is really important for that, right?
Right.
Well, and I've had times too where I've had to write bad code because of time constraints or business constraints that were outside of my control. And like you do the best you can, but then you're like, well, and I always comment on here, this should be refactored. This is not great. Had to do this because of what? But sometimes people don't put comments in the code to explain that. There's a whole genre of people who definitely do not like comments in code. And so sometimes you don't get that narrative. And so sometimes, really just going and asking the person, what led you to this lovely bit of...
And I think that's like my style of interviewing is more to get a personality out of a person than a... Like, I mean, yes, there's tech questions and, like I said, the explain plans and the blah, blah, blah. There's some nitty gritty details. But even like all of that stuff can be like learned and taught and developed, right?
Right.
So anyway, back to the case that we were talking about, that person isn't a good fit for that organization, right? They can still be a fine developer somewhere else, but in your situation, they just don't fit. They just come in, maybe they're too strong-willed. They do things my way or the highway, right? And that developer just isn't going to work.
Right. Well, in some cases, there have been places where that's the kind of person they really wanted.
Right.
They want the go-getter that's going to come in and he's going to, or she's going to lead, and they're going to take the reins and just plow forward. But I think more than not, like if somebody's watching this and that's your personality style, there are places out there for you for sure. But I would think being able to work with a team is probably one of the most important parts because you're always going to have to.
Right. Have a strong opinion, be able to defend that opinion and be able to set aside that opinion and go with the team, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of consulting 101 is like, you should have an opinion about how things are supposed to be done. You should know that we're not putting everything in the controller. We are going to separate that out. However, if the rest of the team is like, I don't know how to do that, we can't do that right now, we just got to put it in the controller and go, okay, then that's what we got to do. Right?
What kinds of things do you like to ask to try to differentiate between some of those more junior developers, some of the intermediate developers, and folks that you think are really going to be able to step in and recommend solutions? Some of the more senior and architect style roles.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite things is when people tell me I don't know and ask me, can you tell me what the answer is? Because that shows, for one, they're willing to admit they don't know, because none of us know everything. And that's okay. Everybody needs to be comfortable and be okay with not knowing everything.
Right.
I don't
And
know.
for
Have you met
two,
Chad?
well, I mean, Chad does not count because, of course, he knows everything. But
Anyone else?
for the rest of us, but then also follow up with, can you tell me what the answer is? I actually think my first programming job I got because I said, I don't know, can you explain it to me? And he was so excited. He jumped up, he goes to the whiteboard and he's marking it all up and explaining it to me.
Wow.
And then we had a discussion about it.
Nice.
And I think that's actually what got me the job.
That makes sense. A lot of sense.
To answer Sarah's question, I mean, I always start from the same spot, but for more senior guys, for more senior people, I will start throwing like the performance thing. We get deeper and deeper into the performance, and then we start scaling, right? Like, hey, you got 1,000 users, now you got 1 million, now you got 1 billion. Like, what are the scaling opportunities and what technologies help with that? So like,
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. I'm going to have to write that one down.
When experience helps with that, right?
Right. And you might not, I mean, you're not going to run into a lot of folks that have built applications that have 1 billion users, but the fundamentals kind of stay the same, right? Like, hey, tell me about, horizontal scaling versus vertical scaling. Tell me about caching on the front end. Tell me about like distributed caching. Tell me about network. Like, tell me all of this stuff. And you can really get, you can really kind of suss out like the folks that just don't know anything about anything other than I built a Spring Boot app once and, I just only ever did that, versus the people that have maybe that has been their career and that's been their experience up to that point, but they would know that, like Akamai and all of those vendors exist to solve these problems for you and understand the concepts.
And honestly, I think a senior developer should have at least hit one point in time where their app was slow and it wasn't really the code that was the problem. It was hey, we've got 4,000 users now and we only had 200 when we started. I think we need more hardware, or we can't get more hardware. So I guess we're going to be caching in the front end or caching on the back end or doing different things to get us through, right?
Yeah. And those are the answers I don't like are the guys that just throw hardware at it, right? Like, I'll just grab a bigger database instance, or I'll grab a larger app server instance size, right? Like, okay, that's a fine answer for some for a lot of these, but
is it though? I mean, bigger database, if your queries are all sub, tenth of a second performance, bigger database server ain't going to help you at all.
It's just kicking the can at that point.
It goes back to Jen's point of asking those questions, right? And I think that's but what you're saying, I think, Chad, you're also kind of saying the same thing, that when you start asking those questions, now you want to scale. Just hearing them answer or work through the problem they had, well, you're going to have to think about these things, and you're going to have to talk about this, right? That's speaking to that, as opposed to just saying, well, you just throw hardware at it, right? As they talk through, these are some of the, techniques or things that I would think about when scaling. That's kind of what you're driving for.
So do you guys find that the electronic interviews go faster, longer? They take a while to get used to, but now are they easier than doing in person?
I think there's pros and cons. Honestly, for me, to figure out how long they're going to be really depends on how well I click with the person.
Sure.
Or there's been a lot of times where I get somebody who claims to be a senior developer and is very entry level. And if you're asking those questions and there's really basic stuff that they can't answer the questions, I might lead them a little bit, but if it's obvious they don't have the answers, it ends up shortening, because you're like, okay, well, I think for SDG, and it depends on, who I'm interviewing. If you're interviewing for an entry level, that's a different situation, right? But then if you're interviewing for a junior and they can't even, speak to some of the entry level stuff, and it's question after question of like them just fumbling and not being able to answer anything.
So saying I don't know is good, but saying I don't know for everything is not so great.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Hey, quick question. This has nothing to do with, but a junior developer, like associate level developer, to just like I'm a developer to I'm a senior. How many years do you attach to that senior role? Like if you say I'm a senior developer. How many years do you instantly how many years instantly comes to mind?
I don't put years on it at all. Personally, I don't put years because it's about experience. You could have somebody that has been thrown into the fire and has more of like a senior level knowledge that has only been doing it for 2 years. And you could have somebody who ends up at a company where they have been doing development, but the same thing, and it's really not much development for 5 to 10 years, and they come out and they're still like doing VB6 and have no idea about anything other than what that company had them doing. And that would be a little bit more entry level, even though they may have been doing it for 10 years, they haven't expanded their knowledge. So honestly, I wouldn't put a year's, I think it's irrelevant.
I'll disagree a little bit. I feel like you need to have been doing development for 5 years-ish at least to get into that senior area. Even if you've been in the fire, you've been fighting a portion of the fire.
That's true.
And it's probably a big fire.
Yeah, that's true.
But to get that broad experience that kind of brings you into a senior level, you've tuned the database, you've tuned the front end, you've done different things along the way. It's hard to get all that experience in 5 years. Now, if you asked me when I was a developer and I'd had 2 years of experience, I thought I was a pretty senior developer way back when. But now, like with 25 years of experience, like where did that, have I just been a senior for 20 years? Probably not.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say, I agree that there has to be some, there has to be some amount of experience there. So there's definitely like a time. And I think I'm probably kind of in the same boat as you that it's probably not going to happen sooner than 5 years. And then I completely agree with Jen's point because I've come across those folks that have worked in a single app at a single company. And that's not a bad thing at all. It just means that there's probably going to be some gaps in experience and knowledge compared to another person. And so being able to, if that individual can speak to those gaps, like, yeah, we've been doing this. I know there are other ways to do it. Like, we've talked about doing this and this, like that goes a long way. Right.
But I have VB6 installed, so I'm really not going to try anything else new. Why would you? This is great. Chad, how about you? What's a senior for you?
7 years.
7 years. The magic 7 year.
Yeah, I didn't really think about Jen's qualifier on it and Sarah's. I mean, in 7 years, and that's really like that in my head. That's when I felt like I could honestly put that qualifier in front of my title, right, and not be dishonest about it.
Not having it italicized.
Right.
Though I hate about titles is that honestly, a lot of companies, they will just give you a new title because they have to in order to fill out the paperwork to get a raise that they want, right? So they'll keep inventing new titles. And a lot of the times the titles are kind of meaningless. They just needed to give you a new title in order to justify a raise so you didn't leave the company or something. Yeah. I've been in that situation several times.
It is very much an artificial construct, right, that companies create to justify different salary bands in a lot of cases. But like, I think it matters for us at SDG for us to say like, hey, this is a senior person and, sell our services to clients, as opposed to, not, like this is a individual contributor to a project and they're super happy to do that and incredibly competent, but,
Right. Well, that goes to the interviewing process, that it's really important that we ask those questions and try and really nail down what that level is, despite how many years of experience they have, or despite what their previous title was.
Senior access developer doesn't ring as hard as sort of a senior Java enterprise developer does, right?
I don't know. I mean, if you call yourself a senior access developer, I kind of want to meet you and see what you've done. Do you guys have like a couple of like favorite go-to questions that you ask people every single time just to get them either comfortable? Like I talked about what I used to do that I don't, just for Jana's sake, wouldn't do that anymore. Probably not. But do you have a couple of icebreaker questions that you ask, or things that you always 100% you just like a go-to question?
I always ask what they're currently working on. I think, Sarah, you already said that too, that you asked it, but like, what are you currently working on? And then I always follow it up with, what don't you like about it?
Yeah, I definitely follow, I follow that same pattern. What are you working on today? And then if they've, sort of not been in the workforce recently? What were you working on? Or tell me about, your average day that you were working, when you were in the workforce or whatever. Because, there are times that people have gotten laid off and they haven't been working on anything. Sometimes they've gotten laid off and they've been working on stuff that day. So I find that exciting too, right?
We'll see if I can talk. Allergies are just kicking in here.
They're bad right now.
They're so bad.
Love
yeah, I love asking, just getting it started with what do you have going on? What's your most recent project? Tell me what you're working on. I wish I had a really fun question, and I think I know Chad's. We've talked about it before, so I'm looking forward to you sharing yours. So I have recently adopted a couple of those kinds of questions. But sometimes when you get into that conversational style, a couple of questions that I often can that come to mind that I've used lately are like, oh yeah, what do you like to do to stay up with some of those latest things that you don't get to work on right necessarily at your job? What do you like to do to play around with that and to learn that on your own, right? So that's one of my favorite questions to ask.
I like that too. I asked that once after you and I had talked about stuff. I had asked that to somebody and they were like, oh, I'm really getting into LLMs and I'm building my own. And he just was so excited about it. You could just see the passion and so that was fun.
Those are easy. All right, Chad, let's hear yours.
Well, no, it's silly. So imagine you're sitting you come into this tiny little office in Northeast Minneapolis, and you're in a conference room. I come in with a 6-pack of grain belt. I crack one open. I start drinking, and the first thing I usually ask people is, "What's the dumbest thing you've done in your career so far?" And they struggle with it. Like initially, like it catches most folks off guard, and you'll get like it takes them a while to like trigger something in their brain that and the things I'm not looking for is like, hey, I made this mistake, but I turned it into a win, right? Like I'm like, no. I want to hear how you screwed up and I want to hear how you fixed it, right? And then we'll start talking about, some of those things. So
I do that too. It's a little slightly different where it's just like, tell me about a mistake that you've made. What was the impact and, how did you rectify the situation?
Yeah.
And it's also a great question for differentiating, I think, in starting to ask it and differentiating the more junior folks from those more senior, because every time when I ask that to a more senior person, like they're almost excited to share it with you, right?
Right. That is a good point. Like people who've been in the business know mistakes happen and they're ready to be like, oh yeah, I totally did that. I totally took down the entire system because I forgot to, include my where clause when I select. I mean, that's obviously don't be
never done that. Never done that.
The worst.
But thankfully,
answer.
there were database backups that day.
I have done that. Actually, I have done that exact thing. Updated. That was early on, but updated production data and forgot my where clause when I selected it. And yes, we had to restore the database.
Yep.
That was terrible.
Just know that sometimes the questions, like one, you might lose control of the interview, right? Like,
right.
So sometimes you'll get an answer so horrible that you talk about it, I guess, 12 years later. That's fun.
So what about also at the giving the person you're interviewing a chance to ask you questions?
Absolutely.
I always try to do that. But when it's conversational, I feel like lots of times it'll come up, but you have to sometimes specifically ask them.
I always like to solicit and say, hey, I'm going to leave time, especially if I'm looking in our current role, if I see that they don't have a lot of consulting experience, this is going to be their opportunity to ask, someone who's doing the job about it, right? So to me, it feels like I'm anticipating that you should have some questions, right?
For sure. I think it's telling when they don't, because this interview process goes two ways, right? I feel like the person should be interviewing SCG or the other company at the same time I'm interviewing them, because it needs to be a mutually beneficial situation, right? 100%. If the person is not happy because the culture doesn't fit or because they don't like their, benefits or whatever, not like we discussed benefits a lot, but like if they don't like how things work, specifically coming from not being a consultant to a consultant, it might not be the place for them to be a consultant. And people who don't have questions kind of feels like I'm just trying to get any job and not, and I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes that's all right, but I feel like
It's
they
okay to
should be,
cast a wide net sometimes.
yes.
I feel like that a lot of time questions that they asked me end up being the thing that I provide the most detail back when I'm giving feedback about the candidate, because the next step, if we like person, the next step is usually to meet with, one of the MDs, something like that. So saying like, hey, this person was, really concerned about, they asked a couple of questions about what commutes might be like. They asked a couple of questions, right? So, just kind of highlighting some of these areas that they talk through. That ends up being a lot of what I share back.
I had a question specifically for Jen and Sarah. And this, I don't even know how to ask this, right? Like, as a guy in IT, I'm always fairly, like comfortable in the interview, and I don't feel like I don't have any weird experiences in interviews other than the one creep that should probably be in jail right now. As women in IT, do you guys have, like, what's your experience when they realize, oh, this, and maybe it's not any different at all, right? Like maybe every single interviewee has progressed socially to the point where like, oh yeah, I'm interviewing with, do you have any like weird stories interviewing men or women where like became an issue for them?
I would say that it's shifted a little bit. So before I joined STG and did interviewing, one of the companies that I worked at, they would just set up a technical interview. So the person that was coming in didn't know, and we usually did that technical interview as like a team. Like there'd be 3 or 4 of us that would they'd really just set aside a day and be like, oh, we're going to be hiring, and so like people are going to be coming in out of the conference room that you're doing a technical interview for. And so they didn't know necessarily who they were meeting with. They didn't see the list. So I had one time there where a person came in and they were surprised that everyone on the other side of the table, we were all women. And I could tell like that was a visible surprise. I mean, they rolled with it and did totally fine, but you could just see like, oh, am I in the right room? Was kind of the you could just see it, right? Am I in the right place? So, and it wasn't bad, but from there on, it went totally fine. I would say the other thing that has been a little funny, when we were doing in-person interviews, we would do them often over like a lunch, right? So you'd set up a lunch. And there was a time that someone sat down and, we were having an interview. Again, no problem during the interview, but somebody that they knew walked by and gave that person like a double look, right?
Oh.
And he had,
because they thought you were on a date.
He had a wedding ring on, right? And right, so
it's just lunch.
Like texting his wife.
And so he's like, just a minute, I had to get up and be like, and he came back, he's like, I just had to let him know that I was on an interview. So again,
That's funny.
it was, I didn't, get anything. The interview itself was fine. It was just kind of one of those funny moments, right?
And Jen, you kind of said that hasn't happened to you.
No,
at all.
I haven't. I mean, if somebody was uncomfortable because I was a woman or they didn't expect me to be, I mean, they recovered, and if anything, I would say, actually, no, I don't have any really juicy stories. It's been quite boring.
I'm actually like genuinely relieved that that's the case, right? Like,
yeah, it's wonderful.
That hasn't been a thing. And I can't think of a time when it would have, but like, I just didn't know if there was a different experience for you guys compared to like what Peter and I might do, right?
Sure. Well, and I think too, I have a tendency to take control of the situation. I think how you carry yourself can really dictate how it goes. Like if I'm just not a timid person, and I'm kind of extroverted, so I think that part of it people come in and I'm like, all right, this is what we're doing. And I'm like, answer these questions. I mean, obviously
they're not going to take over and turn.
Yeah, I'm not timid. I'm not like, I'm asserting myself in those situations just because that's my personality style. So that it might be, that's why.
I can actually co-sign this because I genuinely bumped into Jen at a Costco in Maple Grove once, and within 30 seconds she's like, I will pile drive your ass. Or what was it? It was there's some sort of MMA move.
Oh yeah, because my daughter does MMA, and she's 13, but at the time she was probably 11 or 12, and I was like, you better watch yourself or I'm going to have my daughter pile drive you.
That's right.
My daughter, you're going to get taken out by an 11-year-old girl.
Yeah.
Jen farms it out to her youngest.
Well, here's the thing. Well, she's technically my oldest, but also
Oldest, sorry.
she is taller than me.
Oh,
And she is stronger than me. And no, she's got this.
she's got that. Nice.
Yeah. I behaved right after that.
I think I put you, I think I may have put you in a headlock at some point, actually.
Yeah. Rings a bell.
I don't know. He tried to block out those memories.
So do you guys ever long for in-person interviews again?
Yes and no. The ease of doing it from home is nice. And I have younger children. And so it really makes it a lot easier to be able to fit it into the schedule, especially when you're trying to fit it in with billing and consult. You know, I'm out at a client and I have to make time for it. It makes it, but I do miss in person. I guess I do miss it if I really think about it. I miss being able to just sit there and see how they react to the stuff, see those physical, you know, if they're getting uncomfortable, are they fidgeting, or if they're like getting really excited about a topic because they're really passionate about it. I mean, you can get some of that on camera, but
yeah, I guess I don't know about long for it. Like I guess I feel like it'll work either way. If someone were to say, they'd like to do an in-person interview, I'll be there. When there was a time where we were doing them kind of a lot, like we were doing a lot of hiring at one point, and those in-person ones, to Jen's point, like it was because I was at a client, so there'd be a lot of driving to
have a half hour to meet them, half hour back, hour for the interview. That's 2 hours.
Pros and cons.
Yeah.
I do really like the in-person. I do. So, if someone said, let's make this an in-person interview, I would for sure be in.
Nice. Chad?
Yeah, I've really mostly done in person. And yeah, I mean, if I start doing that again, then yes, I would very much prefer it be in person. And I think, like, I don't even know, it might actually weigh on my decision one way or the other if the other party was like, I kind of really need it to be virtual. I'm like, well, this is a consulting gig and there's flexibility involved and, blah, blah, blah. So kind
of answers my first question.
Yeah. A tiny bit, right? Because we do have a lot of remote folks, and
sure,
I guess it's fine.
There's no guarantees in life, though.
Yeah, but I mean, there was a period of time where a previous gig, we wanted to hire a bunch of people rapidly, and so I just spent almost all day, like Sarah's saying, like I spent almost all day in a conference room interviewing. And I wasn't able to drive home at the end of that day because of how I interviewed.
Because of your opening.
The opening act, yeah.
Opening act, huh?
And then all of a sudden you're like, these are not my shoes. Whose shoes am I wearing?
You've heard that story already? Well, a fun story about that day, the guy that, the last interview of that day, and the guy noticed, he's like, is this, I must be like one of your, your fourth or fifth interviews. And I'm like, I didn't know. He's like, well, I'm imagining you do this same song and dance. And then, and so I'm like, oh, that's well observed, sir.
Right for observant.
Yeah. And yeah, we hired the dude, and he's one of my good friends still. So
nice.
It's great.
So culture fit found and successful, right?
Yep. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're ready for anybody have any final thoughts on tech interviews for folks out there.
Don't be afraid to interview the other person as well and ask questions. And don't be afraid to say you don't know. Even if you don't know the answer to every question, I'd rather you tell me I don't know than you try to fumble through it and I know you're wrong.
But do be afraid that Jen's daughter will pile drive.
That's right. Yes. Nice. Chad, anything for you?
I mean, my biggest goal is always to make the other person as relaxed as possible. And I try really hard. I mean, yes, there's some core tech skills, but it's easy to develop tech skills. It's harder to develop personalities. So I go really hard on a cultural and a personality fit. And that's, I mean, if you can develop some questions and techniques for sussing that out in an hour interview or 90-minute interview, I think you're going to find much better. You're going to have a lot more success with the folks you bring on than somebody that will eventually just be a problem.
Yep. And I'd just like to add, be honest, be open. You're there to fit in, right? And if you don't fit, nobody's going to be happy that you're there. Most of all you, right? If you've gone into a place that you're uncomfortable. All right. Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.